Throughout its history, Washington, D.C. has been the destination of protesters as a way of publicly making their opinions heard in an attempt to influence public opinion or government policy, or so they may undertake direct action to enact desired changes themselves. However, on July 28, 1932, the U.S. government attacked their own in a shameful display of power, using tanks, bayonets, and tear gas. To make matters even worse, all of this occurred under the leadership of textbook heroes such as Douglas MacArthur, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and George S. Patton. But what did the protesters want? What was the Bonus Army? And what happened to them? Let's try and find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
The World War I vets were part of a bonus army who came to Washington, D.C. to make a demand for their promised wartime bonuses. After victory in World War I, the U.S. government promised veterans in 1924 adjusted compensation. They would receive $1.25 for each day they served overseas and $1 for each day they served in the States. Veterans owed $50 or less were paid immediately. Everyone else was given a certificate that would collect 4% interest with an additional 25% tacked on upon payment. However, the Great Depression hit, beginning with the stock market collapse of 1929. By 1932, the Depression was still dragging on with no end in sight. Out of work, disgruntled, and out of sheer desperation, some of the veterans decided to march on Washington and ask for their bonus right away. The movement had begun in Portland, Oregon, where 400 veterans had gathered there on May 17, 1932, under the leadership of fellow veteran Walter M. Waters. They began a long trek to Washington aboard a freight train loaned to them for free by the rail authorities. After exiting the train in Iowa on May 18th, they hitched rides and walked the rest of the way to Washington. Smaller splinter groups reached the capital on their own and would join them. By June 1st, 1,500 men, some with their families, were in Washington. They camped out in homemade shanty towns, and the largest was a 30-acre site on the Anacostia Flats. The Anacostia site was given the name Camp Bartlett after its owner, John H. Bartlett, a former assistant postmaster general and former governor of New Hampshire, who let the veterans camp there. It was also on June 1st that D.C. Police Superintendent Brigadier General Pelham D. Glassford first entered the picture. In the coming weeks, he was to prove more sympathetic to the men than the other authorities, and they appreciated it. He asked Congress for $75,000 to feed the marchers, but the request was turned down. 2 weeks later, the U.S. House of Representatives did in fact vote to provide the bonus to the veterans, but the U.S. Senate rejected it. President Herbert Hoover had promised to veto the bill. Things stayed in an unsettled condition for the next few weeks, with more veterans arriving until their number reached between 10 and 20,000. Then, on July 28th, the Hoover administration sent in the Army and police to expel the marchers from Washington. The commander of the operation was none other than the Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, who branded the Bonus Army as traitors bent on overthrowing the government, declaring, "Pacifism and its bedfellow, communism, are all around us." MacArthur's young aide was future Supreme Allied Commander of Europe during World War II and future U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, while then Major George S. Patton led the 3rd Cavalry, which spearheaded the eventual eviction of the Bonus Army. The three military icons got their chance to strike on July 28, 1932, when a scuffle between the Bonus Army and D.C. police resulted in 2 fatally wounded veterans. The U.S. Army assault ensued, comprised of 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and 6 tanks. When asked by the Bonus Army leader, Walter Waters, if the veterans would be given the opportunity to form in columns, salvage their belongings, and retreat in an orderly fashion, MacArthur replied, "Yes, my friend, of course." But after marching up Pennsylvania Avenue, MacArthur's soldiers lobbed tear gas and brandished bayonets as they set fire to some of the tents. In a flash, the whole encampment was ablaze. Sadly enough, one of the veterans Patton routed out was a Joe Angelo of Camden, New Jersey, a soldier who had saved Patton's life in World War I by dragging the wounded Patton into a nearby foxhole and staying with him through the night. Angelo was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his efforts. The next day, the New York Times ran an article under the headline, "A Cavalry Major Evicts Veteran Who Saved His Life in Battle." Patton would later say, "Undoubtedly, this man saved my life," but his several accounts of the incidents vary from the true facts. When one of the troops was asked about the expulsion of his fellow veterans, he exclaimed, "We hate this more than they do, but they brought it on themselves." During the chaos, some veterans retreated to Camp Bartlett, figuring they might have been left in peace there, for the government's orders were to clear federal land, while Camp Bartlett was on private property. But it didn't help. The Army had orders to clear Camp Bartlett too. While all of this was going across the city, many civilians were caught up in the violence, many trying to escape the clouds of tear gas. One bystander kept shouting at the troops, "The American flag means nothing to me after this." MacArthur threatened to have the man arrested, who promptly quieted down. After it was all over, the authorities involved gave their reactions. President Hoover released a statement on July 28th, in which he falsely concluded an examination of a large number of names discloses the fact that a considerable part of those remaining are not veterans. Many are communists and persons with criminal records. MacArthur said of the Bonus Army routing, "It was animated by the essence of revolution." He added that only about 10% of the men driven away from the camps were actually genuine veterans. The saddest part, less than 10 years later, MacArthur, Patton, and Eisenhower would be earning a place in the history book by sending many of those same disenfranchised veterans to their grisly deaths on the battlefield of Europe and the Pacific in World War II. During the Bonus Army tragedy, 2 veterans lost their lives in the assault, and an 11-week-old baby died from gas-related illnesses. In addition, an 8-year-old boy was partially blinded by gas. 2 police had their skulls fractured, and 1,000 veterans suffered gas-related injuries. On July 29th, General Glassford denied that he had wanted troops to clear out the camps, or that his police couldn't have handled the situation peacefully before violence broke out. He also blamed the removal order for causing all the trouble, and had opposed the use of troops. As for the newspapers of the day, the Associated Press released a list briefly describing their editorial reactions. Out of 30 papers, 21 more or less supported the government's response. The Ohio State Journal of Columbus, Ohio, for instance, wrote, "President Hoover chose the course that Lincoln chose, that presidents have always chosen." One paper that did have the brass to report the truth was the Chicago Herald and Examiner, referring to President Hoover by name and calling his actions sheer stupidity that were without parallel in the American annals. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a candidate for the president in 1932. It is said that the day after the Bonus Army eviction, he told an aide there was no longer any need for him to campaign against Herbert Hoover, and he may have been right. But his subsequent election did little to help the veterans of World War I. FDR not only refused to pay the bonuses, he also reappointed MacArthur as the Army Chief of Staff. A second Bonus Army came in May of 1933. And this time was greeted by the new president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Although again, no bonus legislation was passed, Congress did create the Civilian Conservation Corps, in which many of the veterans were able to find work. The veterans were given the opportunity to work in veterans rehabilitation camps, like those in the Florida Keys. Unfortunately, it is there that they met their demise on Labor Day in 1935, when a hurricane unlike any ever recorded in the United States struck. Wind gusts, estimated at 200 miles an hour, slammed into the work camps in the Florida's Upper Keys, turning granules of sand into tiny missiles that blasted flesh from the faces, wrote Paul Dixon and Thomas B. Allen in a Bonus Army and American epic. The storm had killed 259 veterans. The final indignity was their mass cremation. In 1936, the veterans finally did get their bonus when Congress voted on the money over President Franklin Roosevelt's veto. Despite such treatment, the legacy of the Bonus Army lives on in the passing of the GI Bill in 1944, which is still in use today. The act puts higher education, job training, and home ownership within the reach of millions of veterans. This incident, to me, as a fellow veteran, was one of America's darkest stains. Veterans fought for our freedoms and risked their lives, whether or not we realized it, appreciated it, or even agreed with it. Without the service of veterans, we would not have the freedoms we have today. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.